So, for people to understand where I'm coming from, you kind of have to understand how we evolve. Okay. So, think of the hierarchy of needs. Basically, we have our physiological needs, safety, love and belonging, self esteem. That's split into negative and positive, because that's when you start moving from your deficiency needs to your growth needs. Then we have self actualization and self transcendence. Now, over time, what we've learned is that these aren't finite states. So, just as someone can rise through these states, they can fall just as quickly. And why is that? Because humans need to meet the living conditions with coping mechanisms. So, according to someone that maybe someone like George of the Jungle or Jungle the Jungle, you see these movies where these individuals are just completely out of their element and they still are kind of interacting from a primal state of mind specifically. And why is that? Because of the living conditions that they've always lived, they haven't really thought about expanding themselves because their world has been so small. So when you live in developed countries, first world, second world, the awareness of others and yourself and the world becomes, how do you say, inclusive. And what that allows you to do is to take in consideration the self in the world, because we have this egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric. So you start expanding your perspective from the points of views that you have, which is first person, second person, third person. Now, this is something that the Japanese had for a very long time in terms of their own philosophy, that we have different masks that we show the world, that we show our loved ones, and then what we show ourselves, right? And the one that we show ourselves is going to be the most pure or truest expression of ourselves. So what happens is that with these perspectives, we basically follow this ego, ethno, world-centric, cosmic-centric perspectives. So we develop ourselves from our first person, how we see ourselves in the world. Second person, how we interact with others from ourselves, and then how we see ourselves from a third person perspective. You can think about it like video games, okay? So when we are now getting into these elements of growing up from the stages and then waking up in the states, right? We start to see that a lot of the ancient traditions that we study in terms of religion or any spirituality, they don't really have something that is all inclusive, okay? When I studied AQual, all quadrants, all level, I started to connect a lot of the ancient traditions that we were looking at for the longest times, right? We look at Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, and we now start to see that we can have waking experiences, right? You can wake up at a certain stage. Okay, so this is known as the Wilbur-Combs lattice, right? So think about it as something like, what is it? Connect the dots, right? Connect four. So you have these things or chips, right, that you're placing at the lowest part, and that can rise up until you connect four. And then the same way with the lateral, right? So longitudinal, latitudinal. And that's just basically how we work with ourselves, okay? Because at every stage, you can have these different states. Now, the way that the states work, okay? The states work from gross, which is the physical realm. We're looking at subtle, the astral or mental plane, okay? Because the mind is basically a field of energy, okay? And you can think about it as how we focus, okay? So we feel most in the front, we feel a little bit less in the middle, and then we feel even least in the back. So that's how we are layering reality, okay? From physical to mental to energetic, okay? Now, that's just one section of the waking states, okay? You can think about this as waking, awake, sleep, which is where you're dreaming, dream state, and then deep sleep, where it's completely nothing, right? Where you just have such a deep sleep and you don't even remember the dream. Now, there is something that's always aware. That I amness is always aware through all these states. And that's what we really source the energy of God, okay? This is where most of our experiences is coming from, because there's something that we are understanding about forms. Now, the Greeks had this idea very, very long ago with Plato and then Aristotle, where forms are basically a priori or posteriori knowledge, okay? So there are many arguments if you really want to go deep into the philosophy, but it doesn't really matter. But basically, what Plato said was that there was something that already had meaning into it, and Aristotle said that it already had meaning to it, and that's how we're interpreting it. So very similar to books, okay? So where does the meaning come from? Is it because we read the book and then we derive meaning from it, or was it that the book already had meaning and that's what we're receiving? So depending on the perspectives, that's what we're looking at in terms of forms. You ever go through A Course in Miracles, it basically starts dissecting, not dissecting, it's not an appropriate word, more of the disattachment to form, okay? And why is that? Because we become so ingrained in terms of how real this feels, okay? So think about dreams. If you ever have a lucid dream, it's basically the same thing that occurs when you wake up. The dreams feel so real until you realize that you're dreaming, okay? And that's just a moment of lucidity, okay? And that's because you become aware of the formality of it, right? Something's not right. Maybe you look in the mirror, or maybe you have a mark that just reminds you that you're dreaming, okay? And there's been plenty of studies. Of course, you're not really sleeping, you're just awake as your body's going down into the layers of consciousness. So of course, you can look at waking, dreaming, deep sleep as conscious, subconscious, and unconscious mind. Now, usually if you are going into this practice to search for enlightenment, it usually takes about 4 to 6 years of meditation to actually reach 1 or 2 levels higher than your predominant center of gravity. Now, what is the center of gravity? According to Ken Wilber, because I'm using a lot of his theory to explain this to people, because it's very difficult to understand anything that's above your mind, okay? And that's why when people are talking to you, when they use theories like this, or they try to explain these mystical experiences in some form, it's almost like it's above your head. And that is because, as we learned from Nietzsche, that words can only get so close to the truth, okay? Why is that? Because it's finite, right? And for us to really experience what we really are, we have to go beyond what we know of ourselves. So when we're going beyond what we know of ourselves, then our mind expands. It's kind of like a muscle, okay? It becomes stronger as you expand it, right? The only problem is that most oftentimes people have these Satori moments or Kensho moments, a moment of pure awakening, and they become almost disappointed because it's almost like they did something wrong to be locked out of heaven, right? To be locked out of Shangri-La. And it becomes this new purpose that people will seek. So of course, there are those that are completely devoted to the path. Now, most oftentimes these individuals will completely dedicate their entire lives to this, and will reach a point where they're loving, maybe even in joy if possible. But we have to understand that everything is a bell curve, okay? So not everybody can be a genius, and not everybody can be mentally incapacitated, okay? And there's something in the balance, because that's how everything fluxes, okay? There's ups and downs. That's the rhythm of life. So now we're understanding the laws of the universe. When people keep seeking and trying to push, right? Think about going to the gym and you keep pushing and pushing until you blow out a muscle. So just like with a muscle, our paradigms can blow, okay? Now, it's okay if it happens because that's basically that moment. But if you do not allow the internal mechanisms with the intelligence of the body, that means emotional, physical, and mental, psychological, then you're going to cause some form of irreparable damage, okay? Or you're going to go through this painful process to try to make sense of things because it doesn't make sense to you. Because again, you're living in this real world and now you're trying to escape. That's basically it. So we see this a lot with people that practice plant medicine, or they do entheogens. And these entheogens allow, as Aldous Huxley say, open the doors of perception, right? So you're just basically allowing the connections of your brain to kind of see the underlying woven fabric of the intelligence of the world. This is what they call the matrix, okay? So there's an underlying grid that kind of just puts everything in order, okay? It's called chaos theory in some disciplines, synchronicity, serendipity. And most of these individuals that kind of have that Satori moment, most oftentimes if you're using entheogens or some form of plant medicine, you are going through Kensho, right? So it's pure pain that allows you to go into crisis. And this is what surrendering yourself is. So you find crisis, you go through crisis, and then you find what Christ is in the Christian ideology, if you want to call it that. So the worst thing that's ever happened to you becomes your own salvation. And why is that? Because most oftentimes there are things that are holding us back, okay? And why is that? Because we have created such a elaborate maze for us to reach that, and it becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because that is what is locked within ourselves. So we look at Inception, like the movie. You have this idea of yourself, and that actually roots to everything up. So Carl Jung, he said that there's no tree that reaches heaven that doesn't have its roots in hell. And you have to start to understand the duality of things. So we look at the physical, mental, energetic, and now we're going into the Akashic realm, and then we're looking at the bliss realm. Now, these later states, right, you can actually have these experiences at any stage of your life. So that's why we have shamans, right? Very indigenous, tribal mentality, right? Ethnocentric, that doesn't see anything more of world-centric, cosmic-centric, right? The universe, because they don't really need, like, they just have food, plants, like everything is made for them in that level. But they still have this expanded perception or consciousness, conscious awareness of themselves from that stage. Okay, now it is possible for someone to actually be at a lower stage and have these experiences. Examples are like Andrew Cohen. Okay, now they did a whole special on how he created cults, just like Osho, right? These individuals basically fall so low within themselves because they're just thinking that they are the Messiah, or they are the most enlightened being, because it's all ego. It's that centric. It's just focused on the self, and it can actually get very bad once it starts becoming something like Charles Manson. Okay, so when you look at these individuals in comparison to, you look at individuals like Sadhguru, Eckhart Tolle, Michael Singer, Asira, you see these individuals that there's a purity to them. Now, Adyashanti, right, another enlightened being, basically said that this moment of self-realization, right, now you can have a Satori moment and a Samadhi moment, but a self-realization is basically understanding who you are in the essence of all this. Okay, and that is a moment that opens the possibility. Now, it doesn't mean that it's guaranteed that you're going to be enlightened. It just means that it makes it possible, because now you're getting a taste of what you are, right? Most oftentimes, these self-realizations allow ourselves to continuously be self-transcendent. Okay, now when you start getting into these later states, okay, and you're not at a level that's reaching the second tier, so let's just think about, again, Connect 4, or just like Super Mario, we have different worlds. Okay, for us to reach a more integrated understanding, integrated means that it's all interconnected for us, we must pierce through the first tier, the first level. Okay, there's a second level, and then there's a third level. Most oftentimes you'll never get to this third level because, again, there's a bell curve for most individuals. The second tier is very possible for most individuals, but again, we're looking at 2%. So most oftentimes everybody's going to be in this first level. Now, if you are someone that studies either spiral dynamics, Claire Graves, the emerging levels of existence, Ken Wilber, they're all the same, right? They're all using Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs in a more sophisticated manner. Again, Abraham Maslow changed his hierarchy of needs to amend it to not just self-actualization, but to self-transcendence because of Claire Graves. Okay, he basically just said that it's not a perfect map, right? The map is just something to maneuver through the territory. When you have these moments of self-realization, then it allows you to actually have these moments of pure awareness. Why? Because there's no confusion as to what you are. You know who you are, and as you're going through a moment of witnessing, okay? The way that it happened to me was that I was going through A Course in Miracles, and I was reading this lesson, I think it was like 169 if I remember correctly, and it basically said that the mind has set the moment of revelation. Now, you won't know that moment, but that moment will allow you, because of the devotion, contemplation, and spiritual practice that you may be doing, whether it's Kriya or some form of yoga that allows you to kind of have the realization but understand the mechanics of life making. Now, usually it's a combination of all three. So you can go through this process just by releasing, which means that you're going through this jhana, right? It's basically understanding, like, who am I? Great individuals that kind of do this very well are Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj, right? I'm not the body. Or Lester Levinson, or Dr. David Hawkins, okay? Now, why is that? Because what we are doing is just unraveling, right? It's not that you're adding anything, it's that you're unraveling more of yourself. So basically, you go through the process of looking at your tendencies, you're looking at your emotions, and you're looking at your attachments or aversions, the things that you avoid, right? These are your desires. Desire to avoid things, desire to attach yourself to things. So what has happened most oftentimes is that you go through this whole process, and as you're releasing, you're now going through the process of thinking and feeling and being, okay? So you get these moments where you release, and then you have these experiences, okay? And that's because of the work and being at the right place, right time, that life is allowing you to communicate. So that's when, what Eckhart Tolle says, nature has been waiting for you for millions of years, because now you are interacting with the environment. It becomes a person-environment transaction, as we learned through biosocial psychology. So as you are now, let's just say, moving up these stages, right? And you do understand integral theory, because you can have it conceptually, but now you have to catch up emotionally. And that's basically what releasing does. Releasing is just letting go of everything that you are holding on to that doesn't serve you anymore. Because at this stage, this second level, all these things are just making it very difficult for you to function in the world, because now your mind has expanded, but your emotions have to meet that too, if that makes sense. Now, you get to this point that you're now integrating the integral theory with the states, okay? So now you're in the second level, and now you're going through the physical, right? The mental, energetic, and now, if with the right guidance, because most oftentimes people won't be able to get out of this continuous cycle, if you want to call it. To see beyond yourself, you need some form of help. So that's why most people turn to some form of entheogen, or something that can open their perception. Most oftentimes, if you have a guru or some spiritual teacher that kind of understands where you're at, it does the same thing. But it's very difficult to understand, because most oftentimes people go down in their stages, right, to reach the state. So they basically just follow a very interesting manner to understand things. Why? Because you basically get down to the point that now you're understanding the separate self, which is the ego. It's just a separate sense of self. This is who I am in comparison to the world, in relationship to the world. And that's how we learn to understand ourselves, right? We go through the process of exploring, discovering, understanding, loving, and then transforming. And that's how we start getting into the self-mastery. Now, as you're starting to understand a little bit more of yourself, then you have to integrate that back into the world, if that makes sense, okay? And that may be very difficult if you haven't had that time to process what's going on. If you're oscillating at a certain speed, then of course everything else needs to catch up to that, or there's going to be some form of misfire or damage, okay? So when you're looking at these moments that you're oscillating, you have to be able to make sure that all the other areas of your life are also congruent, they're consistent, which means the areas of life, relationships, finances, your own spiritual work, hobbies and passions, right? Everything needs to be balanced for yourself to get to these moments. Now, as you start becoming more aware, because now you're starting to understand things in a more connected manner, then when you're going through these states, okay, now you start to hit this, not even an idea, but it's perception, right, of things that are rising, right? Because most oftentimes when you do entheogens or you do like plant medicine, you are still awake, right? But you're going into the subtle, which means you're going into the dream state while you're awake, which is why people start hallucinating or they start seeing elves or whatever it may be, because you are now kind of seeing the smoking mirrors of the illusion of this matrix, okay? Terence McKenna talked about, how, once you break through, if you really want to call it anything like that, you start to understand that we can only conceptualize things in a third dimension. So once you break through, you're looking at a fourth dimension. The only problem with this is that most oftentimes people break through when they're not ready, okay? And this is a very important thing that we must understand, because again, there is a bell curve, okay? So if you're breaking through, you're becoming an outlier, which is why we have these labeling theories, right? We learn them in criminology, where they become rebels, okay? They become people that are outside of society because they're not conforming with the institutionalism or the ideologies of the world. So it becomes very difficult for them to integrate back. Most oftentimes they actually leave, or they try to find spiritual masters that can kind of help them in this process, because now they're lost, right? They found themselves in some way, somehow, but now they're lost because they've been wandering, okay? They've been wandering too much, and then because they've been wandering too much, they're wandering. So that's why they wander in the forest, because it's so difficult to live in the world when you realize that there's so much more than what this is, that there is so much pain and there's so much chaos. And it's just, understanding that there are necessary evils to have this dualism in this world. Because when we look at the Big Bang, right, the idea is that God came down from the fourth dimension to the third dimension, and because it was unstable, it broke open, okay? So this is the most perfectly imperfect that God can be. And this is when we start to realize that everything is God, okay? So when we start to understand that, it's almost like the movie Avatar, we start to understand that we're all avatars. So we all have the ability to wake up within this world. It's just whether we try to do it the right way or not. Okay? So a warning that Sadhguru gave was that because people are legalizing psychedelics or entheogens, more proper way to say it, is that they're going to destabilize society, just like they're destabilizing themselves. It's almost like climbing 2 ladders, and then you start climbing up 1 ladder. So you have to come back down so you can integrate that back, because if not, then you're going to create something that's irreparable. You're going to break something within yourself. And that's where people start just losing their minds, or yes, pretty much. Let's just leave it at that. So now you're experiencing yourself from these 3 elementary, right? The first couple of elements of physical, mental, emotional, or energetic body. And now we're getting into the witness and non-dual. This is known as Turiya and Turiyatita, right? So non-dual and witness are known as enlightened states. Like, this is as clear as it can get. Now, when you're looking at witness, the world looks like a movie, right? You're looking at it from the audience, or you're looking at it from the 4th wall if you're looking at it from an acting perspective, if you really call it that. So we looked at it from 1st person, 2nd person, 3rd person, and we're all developing, right? It's a quadrant, and you're developing it like this, right? So the more you expand yourself, then you start to expand yourself. Now, the moment that happened to me, as I said before, I realized that the mind is going to give you the moment of revelation. Now, when I had my witnessing moments, my biggest trauma actually came up, right? So that needed to manifest some way and somehow. An underlying terror, such a fear, okay? And someone that actually describes this fear very well is Suzanne Siegel in Collision with the Infinite, right? She talks about her experience, and she was a avid practitioner of transcendental meditation. And what happened was that she just had this moment. She was on the bus, and then it just like hit her, right? Usually that happens with individuals just like Eckhart Tolle or Sadhguru, where it just came out of nowhere. And that's because they were chosen, okay, by the universe to be that. Because again, we have bell curves, okay? And she would always describe this unfamiliar feeling that it was almost as if there was so much terror, but yet like there was nothing that she was really attached to, okay? She even had her child while she was, she never went back. That's basically it. When I had it, it only lasted for a little bit of time. And that's only because of the circumstances that I was in. Because again, everything needs to be balanced. So if all your areas of life aren't balanced, then they're not going to be possible, because you need to be able to sustain yourself to be able to sustain this state. So it's very important to be at least at some form of integrated understanding. Most practitioners in psychology have an integrated understanding because they understand people. So they understand people are at their own developmental stages, and of course we use developmental psychology to understand these states. Because Abraham Maslow and Claire Graves were psychologists, okay? Now, that planted, every single time that you have these experiences like Satori or Samadhi, it plants a seed, okay? Now, when you do some form of entheogen or plant medicine that has DMT in it, that kind of just opens up something, right? Again, it's almost like Inception. There's something planted within you that you kind of just have this profound memory that you'll never forget, okay? And when you have these moments of Satori, you become one with everything, and it's almost like the greatest joke, right? You're just like, I get it, right? And this is the state. And then you just kind of go through this whole process of like, I'm enlightened. For me, when that happened the first time, I was at a club and I was going through so much pain because I'm a dating coach, right? And we kind of teach guys to kind of dominate the social hierarchy, right? We can basically understand people, and we can kind of just work with the environment. The person-environment transaction says that we can provoke, evoke, or elicit, some form of reaction or response from the environment, or we're either reacting to it from the environment. So we can influence it as much as the environment can influence us. So at this point, I think I was just tired, and I was just going through this whole interpretation of rejection, right? And I think I was just talking to this girl. She's gorgeous, just Israeli girl. And, later on, she actually took interest in me because I had that Satori moment, which was the most interesting thing, because at first she didn't give me the time of day, which is okay. But it was a very small club, very intimate. So it was almost like everybody was watching me. So it was that I was seeing myself through her, I was seeing myself through me, and I was seeing myself through everybody else. So because I had that perception, and I just started releasing, because the only thing that was going on in my mind, or at least in my emotions, was that like I just need to get this emotion out. There's something inside of me that I just want to get rid of, and that was the feeling of unworthiness. And as soon as that happened, I just remembered just going into this moment. It was like almost like 5-10 seconds, and I just laughed so hard. It was just like, aha. And then that aha moment, and she was in the DJ booth, she connected with me, and that's what created this form of connection through my presence. So basically what happens is that from the masculine point, we want to reach a form of equanimity where things aren't bothering us. So that's why we go through deep meditation, because what we're doing is creating a safe space. We're creating a container or some form of frame that the feminine can be in. Okay, that's why, when men shift into their feminine, then it becomes very difficult for women to respect them, because it's not stable, right? It doesn't allow women to express themselves, even if they are going to break down, if that makes sense. So I have this moment, and then I just become very obsessed with it. So I start kind of pushing it a little bit further with the entheogens, and then I realized that I didn't want to do that anymore, because it was just so scary. It was just like so intense that you basically go through this process of death, right? Because your body's flooding with DMT, and that's usually the chemical that is released when you're dying, blah, blah, blah. But really, what happens is that it floods so much with DMT that it pushes you out of your body, okay? That's why people look like they're going to sleep when they, go through this process. Most oftentimes, if you're doing plant medicine in a ceremony, it's more gradual, okay? So you go through this process, and the first time it was just very traumatic. Not the experience, but I was just going through a lot of emotional release that was trauma, something that was just very unconscious. And I basically was just trying to push it. But the thing is that you're only able to access, right, that which is granted to you. And that's it, okay? You have to abide by the rules. That's it, okay? The reason why I'm able to do this because I need to tell you that you have to abide by the rules, okay? So I go through this process and I try to do it again because it just felt like I didn't really get what I wanted. And then this was right before Corona hit, okay? So I do it again, and my friend breaks through and I don't. I actually hit this radical emptiness. So at this stage of my life, now I didn't just move from the physical to the subtle, or which is the astral or the mental plane. Now I went to the causal, okay? So I'm here, right? And my friend, not to speak ill or anything, is here, right? Because his perception is very divided, but then he has this moment over here, and I have my moment right here. So from his mind, it expanded so much, but the thing is that it was just too much for him that he just reverted back into lower stages. Not sure really how far, but what we've learned with relationships in terms of where people are in their stages, even with male and female counterpart, there's a clash in terms of the dichotomies or the paradigm that's going on. So basically what happens is that people get divorced because of where they're coming from, there's miscommunication, etc. So now what we are looking at is how far I've gotten. So now I'm in the second stage, and now I'm in out of the 5 states, I'm in the 3rd state. So when I have this witnessing, now I was in the 4th state. Now recently, I just had this moment where I just kind of hacked it, okay? Now, it's not something that you can do, it's only because of how my intelligence works. Because think about The Matrix, the second movie, where Neo meets the architect. Okay? And you go through this whole process over and over again. How many times have you done Neo, right? How many times have I done Brian? And that moment where you kind of just find the key to that door of perception, it opens up that self-realization. So that self-realization led me to meet Sadhguru. And the reason why was because I knew that I was going to push it once again. Because most oftentimes, what we see is that individuals like myself, we understand how it works. Now, I never had a real teacher to teach me this. I just kind of did it myself. So I'm letting you know that this is the most dangerous way you can do this, okay? So that is the most important thing that you take out of all of this, that you do not do this alone, ever, okay? Because you will cause damage, all right? So I met Sadhguru, and then, of course, by his grace, he kind of just, I have this master-disciple relationship. I confide in him who I am, right? I realized who I am. And everybody has their own realization, but again, there's a bell curve. So I let him know, and he knows who I am because he's had people like me before. But I needed to specifically meet him, right? Because he's the only one that can attain and maintain such a level where I'm always under him, okay? Under mine. So he usually functions at this 2nd level, and he can reach this 3rd level if you really wanted to. Now, again, to maintain this 3rd level, you have to be able to understand the inner mechanisms of your system. This is the most sophisticated system that you have. So, of course, if you're maintaining this, you can actually create some form of damage. That's when he consecrated Dhanalinga, because he was at this state. And it was almost as if he were going to die. So he needed to rebuild himself. So again, you can attain this, but maintaining it takes a lot of work. And you need to be balanced in all areas of your life. You need to be able to feed yourself properly for the good prana, nice proper energy, because if you are feeding yourself incorrectly, then your system is going to malfunction. Okay. Now, I had this moment with him, and basically, I go through this process. Once again, I meet, whoever I'm supposed to meet to kind of warn me once again. So I'm doing it correctly because, again, I don't know what I'm doing. I just know that I'm following it by instinct. So with the full moon that just occurred, obviously the, you would call it psychic abilities, the perception of the mind is expanded because of how the mechanism of the human actually is in relationship to the entire universe. So after about 10 years, right? So what happens is that there are individuals that have to go through probably 10 years of meditation, and I have practiced meditation for 10 years. Out of those 10 years, I've been releasing for about 4 years. So I've been extensively going through all my tendencies, all my emotions, all my attachments, all my aversions, and releasing them constantly. Just just about almost every day. Sometimes I would forget, which would mean that I would have to remember and go back to it, but it made it easy for me to attain this. Now, let me rephrase that. It's not that it's easy, it's just that because I was ready for the information, I was granted that. And it's only because I am here to warn you to not push it, okay? Because again, you will blow out a muscle, right? It was just too much for me at that point that I actually just became so scared that I wasn't actually going to relate to people anymore, I started to see things as if they were just, not what they really were. As you go through A Course in Miracles, you kind of see that the meaning, the car is not the car, right? It's just the meaning that you put in the car. And then I just go through this whole entire process of maintaining this balance of all these perspectives. And because I had that fourth wall open, I was able to maintain that holistic state, if you really want to call it that. Now, the only problem with that was that I could only maintain it for almost maybe half an hour. Only because I was supposed to receive the information that I was given. That's it. It wasn't something that I was supposed to maintain because it was just going to cause so much damage. There's so much energy flowing into my body. And basically, if you ever study David Hawkins, you start to understand that there's certain calibrations in terms of how the energy in the body flow. So according to your emotions, your energy body, you maintain a vibration. So those that are angry are always going to emanate that anger, right? You feel anger from people, or they're frustrated or something. Sad, same thing. Loving, same thing. Peace, same thing, right? So that's why people want the blessing of the saint or the grace of the guru, because that is what is going to elevate you in some way, okay? And it's because, of the people that I've met in my life that I was able to at least understand what my purpose was, who I am, and what I'm capable of achieving, okay? it's very difficult for me to really process what's going on because it's something that doesn't really make sense, again, because again it's just something that is above, it's even above my head. And that's really what's going on, because like, it's not that I pushed it too far, it's just that I was at the right place, right time, and that allowed me to understand what that state is, so when it does happen, then I can maintain it. But for me to maintain it means that I have to do the necessary work for me to have my body strong enough to maintain that energy. And why is that? So we look at ancient traditions and we see that Jesus sweat blood. The Buddha broke his bones under the Bodhi tree. And that's something that is very, very, very true. Okay. Now, it may sound like I'm enlightened, but I'm not. Okay. It's just a one taste, right? And that one taste makes everything else possible. Now, please understand that for whatever reason, you're still trying to do this and you didn't understand the first warning. That's if you try to stay in that state and you happen to manage to not create some damage, it's going to have a reciprocal effect to everybody that is around you. Why? Because you have this state, and let's just say that you're at the right stage, and you're imbalancing the universe, okay? Because of that outlier, then things start becoming wonky, right? Very confusing, because now it's an ego thing, okay? So the ego is now becoming holier than thou because it won't die. And that's what's causing so much pain, because the ego's like, okay, I think I did it and I figured it out, but why am I still stuck in this physical body, right? Because everything that is arising, right, you're not attached to it. At first it was witnessing, and it's just, everything was just arising, just like a movie, right? But now you're in this non-dual state, this turatita, right? And now that becomes something that is very, very clear, this non-dual. It's called oneness, okay? So this oneness is very hard to maintain without becoming one, okay? So if there is some form of separation, that is what is causing the discrepancy or disparity within yourself. And that's what's causing so much more pain, because the ego must die. And if you're not ready for it, then of course you're going to create more damage than you did before. So it is possible, right, if you do the work, right? The only reason why I was able to do this, not because I had experience with entheogens, or that I meditated, or that I do Kriya Yoga. I was doing a lot of Kundalini Yoga until recently, because again, it's just so much energy and it will cause damage to your body, okay? I stopped doing the Kriya, started using the Shambhavi Kriya that Sadhguru taught me. Continuously practicing my meditation as much as I can, right, with different frequencies, using the Solfeggio scale, as well as releasing as it's coming up, and then breathing pranayama, so I can kind of just get deeper into my unconscious, so I can just let that go, so I can breathe better. And it was all a combination of all four, right? You're looking at Kriya, Bhakti, Jhana, and when you look at all these yogas, right? I was trying to remember the last yoga, but I can't really think of it at the moment. It's all a combination, okay? Because that's all you're doing. You're understanding that it's all karma. Duh. Right? Karma, right? It's through action. It's through merit. It's through the energy that you're putting out to people. The reason why I'm like this at this moment is because it's too much. It's not what you really think it is. Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, was the second to last, just so you know. He basically spoke about the non-existence of a soul, right? So we talked about this radical emptiness. So there is a radical emptiness as you're having this oneness, as you're witnessing it, as you're feeling it with the emotions, as you're seeing it arising with all the forms, as you're also in your body. And, I needed to knock myself down 2 levels just to make sure that I can process what's going on, because if I maintained a higher state similar to like Ram Dass, yeah, it could have been pretty bad. Again, you need a guide, right? God, as you go through A Course in Miracles, God will give you a guide. Maybe I'm your guide or something like that. Sadhguru is my guide. Which is funny because he's not Christian, but again, it's all-inclusive because it's all together. And for us to understand ourselves, we must be able to allow ourselves to be seen in the world as the world is trying to see itself through us. So as you see the world, so are you. And it's basically just understanding how mirrors work. The reason why I was able to do this was because I was able to have at least 3 mirrors going on. It was the phone, right? So I was aware of the audience. I was having this conversation with myself, and of course, with a second person. Not a second person, but as if I was communicating with myself in the mirror. And because I had developed these 4 quadrants at a pretty decent integrated, I was able to access that oneness, because it's not just separated anymore, it's now together. So we look at these 4 yogas: karma, bhakti, jhana, and what was the last one? Can't even remember it. Bhakti, karma, jhana, and kriya, which is raja yoga. There's just so much terminology. It's kind of challenging sometimes to actually remember everything. They're all the same thing in terms of quadrants, right? You're not really searching for enlightenment. You're searching for happiness. Let the enlightened ones be the ones that guide you. Okay? There's a reason why there's a bell curve. There's things outside of ourselves that we do not understand. It's like work, right? That's why we have work, because a micro, there is a macro. So there are things that are telling us to do things that are telling them to tell us. And that's just kind of like if you ever saw Men in Black. There's universes outside of the universe that's outside of the universe. And it's ever expanding, of course. Happiness is the most important thing. And there's a reason why you're living this life. So you can find that happiness. And the reason why people leave is because the soul or the spirit finds it more important to leave than it is to stay, right? If the body's not, as you would say, capable of withholding the spirit, people turn to drugs or something like that, or there's a car accident, like the body is damaged, so the spirit will leave, right? And that's all we're trying to do. We're just trying to make the transition into the fourth dimension a lot easier, okay? Which is why, if you ever read the Gospels, because after that, those experiences, I needed to turn to something that was different. We start to understand that, let's just say, Christ found a room in the fourth dimension. So when you're about to die, you follow that path that Christ led. And that's basically the same path that everybody does. You find those individuals that have crossed over to the other shore, that have overcome the world. And now that creates a portal, okay, to whatever it is. Because we have this allotted karma. It's like a game, right? We're looking at Connect 4 or Super Mario, and that's the game, right? If you're trying to beat that game within the game, then you go through this process of understanding that you've finished all your karma. And when you finish all your karma, that means you have to start accumulating karma. But for me, I needed to do that twice, right? So I needed to go through that process twice so I can have this conversation with you, so I can now accumulate karma. Because for me, it's not that it doesn't make sense. It's just that it doesn't make sense to people, right? And that's what makes me concerned, and I feel sad, right? Because you can't mess with the karma, right? It's only certain individuals that you just kind of gently push in the direction, right? Because if you take on someone's karma, then there's something that you are taking upon yourself, and that sometimes can be physical manifestations such as hardships, right? Or it could be even internal, right? It could be in your body. Or it could be something even that can affect anybody around you. So it's very important to understand how karma works, because that's the cause and effect of life. So again, we're looking at the universal laws. And when we break the rules, right, we're breaking the law. So what happens when you break the law? You get punished, okay? Because there's an order to things. And of course, there's people that, are rebellious and stuff like that. And there are people that do it properly, that are allowed to access that. But then there's other people that have malintention. That's because they haven't grown up in these stages. So again, we looked at the different areas where we can have these waking states, but we haven't really grown up in these growing stages. And it's good to have something that is beyond you, right? Self-transcendent, because that's what's going to push you. Again, most of these devotees do not attain these higher states in these higher stages. They just won't. Now, they will have satori, they will have samadhi, but there's 8 different types of samadhis, right? And you can have satori in pretty much any kind of state, right? So, again, these devotees balance all the chaos in the world. So they are important for the balance of life. And that's what allows us to see things for the greater good, because that's what you find your purpose in. Okay? But again, if you push too far and you haven't really developed yourself in other areas of your life, it could create a setback. Or you just don't want to live anymore, honestly. Now, for me, I'm not at a point where I just drop too low that I don't want to live. Trust me, I had to go through that when I was very young, right? And that was something that kind of allowed me to process all this, because I already went through that suffering very, very young. And now that's what's going to happen for you, right? You have this realization, whatever it may be, whether it's self-realization, samadhi, or satori, kensho. And now you have to integrate that back into the world, some way, somehow. Either by becoming a devotee, right? Most oftentimes with the Isha Foundation, you have individuals that have these moments and they just don't want to leave or go back into the world, because it's not what they want, right? And then there's other individuals that misuse the knowledge that they have, and they try to capitalize on it. They try to monetize it. And then we look at quotes or proverbs or sayings that as freely it was given to you, freely give. Okay? The only thing that's going to sustain me are the followers. Okay? Because what happens is that you get into these vibrations or frequencies, if you want to call it that, and you're now moving into love and unconditional love. So when we look at the first stage, we're looking at anything that is from shame, guilt, apathy, fear, lust, anger, pride. Then we have this switch, a shift from deficiency needs, right? The forceful emotions, to growth needs, to power, right? So we go through courage, and then neutrality. We're looking at acceptance, love, rationality, reason, and then love. So reason is the last thing in terms of this first stage that we actually experience. And you can see great minds such as Einstein, you have Freud. And then when you go beyond that, you're having individuals such as Carl Jung, where you're having these mystical experiences, okay? And when you start seeing things from this second tier, from a loving perspective, then you have followers, right? And you're looking at a calibration of 500 all the way to 600, okay? 600 is the beginning of enlightenment, right? That is where you're having peace, okay? Before you get to peace, you have ecstasy. And before that, you have joy. And then, of course, you have gratitude right under joy. Which is why they say those that humble themselves are exalted, and those that exalt themselves are humbled. Okay? And you have love. Okay? So, when you cross the threshold to peace, then the followers start to diminish. Okay? Which is why I mentioned that Sadhguru can maintain this second level, so he can reach the millions of people. He's actually reached over 1 billion people. Okay? because of how he can maintain this joy, okay, to basically function and move in the world. But having this experience of one taste, I kind of got into, it's almost like I almost went into the mind of Sadhguru. And, you know, when he talks about voices, when he talks about, you know, when you're not ready, right? You have to trust him. He knows what he's doing, and he knows a lot more than people actually give him credit for. Yes, he is one of the enlightened ones, hands down, just like Eckhart Tolle. But he has tools, right? For Eckhart, he basically describes how to maintain the presence necessary for you to move in the world and actually achieve that, because you're basically just staying with it. Someone like Michael Singer uses the releasing process to maintain that, so you're not attaching yourself, which allows the process to gradually happen. Okay, you start letting go of smaller things to let go of the bigger things. And as you start to realize when you're releasing, is that you sometimes won't want to let go of the bigger things. When you do let go of the bigger things, that's when you're in that shock and awe, or you're eternally grateful. They call them the gift of tears, or the joyful sorrows, right? Because that's basically how the body is going to process that emotion, right? Because that's what's going to allow you to understand what contemplation and devotion actually is. This level of peace is attainable, but it's a continuous thing that you must keep yourself in, right? If you try to do it by yourself. Now, if you are granted what that is, or someone guides you through that process as a guru or a spiritual teacher, then most oftentimes the state will be permanent. But that's because you worked through that dissolving of the personal self. Okay, that personal self doesn't exist anymore. If you try to do it by yourself, it's going to be very difficult, because that personal self is still going to be there for you to understand what you're experiencing, because it's just too much to handle at the moment. And if you're not ready for what you would call dying before you die, then you're not ready for it. Okay? That's basically what I realized, is that I still have people that I love very much, and I still want to enjoy my time with them. You know, I really want to see people grow. I want to see my parents until, you know, they leave. And that's basically what's tying me to this understanding of myself. I'm back at the integral stage, right? After expanding my mind. Because once it's expanded, it doesn't really, because you have that memory of what that really looked like. So it may be that, you know, when both my parents leave, that I actually have no other choice but to get into that state. And of course, I've probably, you know, maintained a high level of joy, which will make everything else very easy for me to cross through the final door, if you really want to call it that. As David Hawkins described it, it's a hell right? So most oftentimes when people do plant medicine or entheogens, they feel like they've been, or if you heard the interview with Megan Fox, she felt like she was in hell, a continuous hell. And again, only you, the I amness, can maintain that awareness for you to move up. But sometimes, again, we need a guide so they can guide us through that whole process. Very, very, very rare do you find someone that can actually do that by themselves. Honestly, I don't think it's possible. I think it's because of who I am that I'm able to do that. But that makes sense, right? Because it's always been something very natural to me, right? And it's something that people wouldn't understand unless they actually go through this process. So again, it's not that you're seeking enlightenment, you're seeking happiness. I promise you, it's better to love the illusion than to want to get out of it. Because of the people you love, it all gives meaning. Even if you don't have family or anything like that, you can, through karma, yoga, devote yourself to people. Through your actions, you give, find purpose in that, have a vision, a mission. It all comes, right? It will come. But sometimes that's not your destiny, right? Your destiny is something else. To be a father, to be a football coach, to be a mother, to teach. Because that's what is allowing everybody else to start waking up. The unmanifested is manifesting through you. That's why you're so important. It's a very beautiful life, guys. I promise you. You're at the place where you're supposed to be at every single time. Because you're at the developmental stage that you're supposed to be at every single time.